but that actually contained the information we wanted.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah. And so, yeah, like I said at the beginning, this is how crazy XXE just suddenly gets. Like, the fact you can kind of do this is insane. But if you're actually using XXE to hunt for specific files on the server, it's kind of a lot of guesswork, right? But if it's a Java application, you can just reference any kind of directory and it will print out the contents of that directory, including hidden files, by the way. So there's an example of a hidden file.
Hey everyone, it's David Bombal back with a very special guest, Tib3rius. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Tib3rius, it's great to have you on the show. You're really well known in the cybersecurity space, but just perhaps for people who don't know about you, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and especially tell us about your YouTube channel? I really want people to know about it.
Yeah, thanks. I've been a web app pen tester for over a decade now. But yeah, in the last 5 years or so, I've sort of moved into content creation. Like I said, I have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/Tib3rius. I also stream on Twitch. Twitch.tv/0x Tib3rius, unfortunately. But yeah, for my YouTube, I upload videos mostly focused on web application security.
So Tib3rius, can you share your desktop so we can see your YouTube channel and just show some of the videos that you've created so people can get an idea of the content that you make?
Yeah, so a recent video people really enjoyed was this one on symlinks, specifically how you can cheese a lot of CTF boxes unintentionally by exploiting symlinks. So that was actually quite a good one.
And you're on Twitch as well, right? So can you show us your Twitch?
Yep. Yeah, twitch.tv/0x Tib3rius. But yeah, I try and stream twice a week, usually Mondays and Wednesdays. The time varies, but usually around 2 p.m. Eastern.
And how often do you post on your YouTube channel?
I try and do a video once a week at least.
So it's brilliant. For everyone who's watching, please go and show the love. Please go and subscribe. Tib3rius has been in the industry for a long time. Really respected, has created courses. Tib3rius, you've also got your own academy. Is that right?
I do, yeah. It's courses.tib3rius.com. Yeah, so I've basically got a few privilege escalation courses. There's one for Windows, one for Linux, or you can get one with a bundle as well, which is for slightly cheaper.
So a lot of people have recommended your content. Stuff that I've seen has been amazing. Rana Khalil, who I've interviewed before, also highly recommended your stuff. So if anyone who's watching, if you want to become an OSCP, get that certification, Tib3rius's courses come highly recommended. You're OSCP, obviously. You got a bunch of certs, right?
I actually did my OSCP, I think in 2017. I was actually quite a late bloomer, so I managed to get through most of my pen testing career without it. And effectively, my boss said, "We've got some extra money for training. Do you want to do it?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure." So
that's so true, right? I mean, in the real world, you don't necessarily need the certs, even though they open up doors. But I mean, it's knowledge that counts.
Yeah. I mean, my career started over 10 years ago. OSCP was active, but it just wasn't really as needed as I think it is probably today.
Now, programming can be overwhelming when you first get started. The good news is that Brilliant has the resources to practically teach you programming. And they teach you programming concepts from beginner level to much more advanced topics. You're going to learn so much more by doing rather than passively watching someone lecture you. And that's what's fantastic about Brilliant. They make learning to code intuitive and fun because they have lots of hands-on interactive quizzes and labs. There are thousands of lessons that cover topics like programming, math, and even AI. From loops to variables, you'll learn essential programming skills by solving real-world challenges. There's no rote memorization. You're not just trying to memorize some boring facts. It's pure problem solving. And it's not just about learning to code. You'll also learn how to think like a programmer. With Brilliant, you'll be writing your own programs in no time. One of my favorite courses is Applied Python. It's packed with hands-on lessons like text analysis and building programs from scratch. And everything's right there with Brilliant's online labs. You don't have to set up something. You don't have to build a lab. It's all available online. You can try Brilliant for free for 30 days at brilliant.org/David Bombal. Plus, you get 20% off your annual premium subscription. Just click on the link in the description or scan this QR code to get started. I'm really excited, though, about what you're going to share. It's XXE, is that right? So perhaps you could take us on this journey, and I'm going to keep quiet now and let you, take it away. I believe you've got some demos, which is fantastic to hear. So, and you're going to put them on GitHub as well, and I'll put those links below. So really looking forward to this.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about XXE. I have coded, ChatGPT helped a lot. But I've coded a few demos just because the ones I was trying to find while prepping for this just weren't working very well. So I feel like these hopefully will let me show what XXE is all about. and people can download them, install them, and exploit them themselves.
So Tib3rius, I've got to ask the beginner questions. What is XXE? Have you got like a basic explanation of what that is, and before we do the demos?
Yeah. So XXE actually stands for XML External Entities. For some reason, they used an X as the second X stands for external. I don't know why. But yeah, so it's XML External Entity. Technically, there's an injection in there as well, but it's not really an injection vulnerability, as we'll see. But effectively, it's using a feature, or a sort of relatively unknown feature, at least for developers, especially of XML, that allows us to do some really, really bizarre things. And one of the reasons I love sharing XXE is that it starts off sort of, okay, you can do this. This is kind of interesting. And then it just gets wild at the end. It's one of those exploits where the more you learn about it, just the more crazy it gets. So I really love sharing it. I wouldn't call it a really common vulnerability. It definitely still exists in the wild. You'll see it a lot of times, especially in older applications, and especially if you upload XMLs like configuration files. If you have any kind of application that uses a configuration file written in XML, there's a high chance it could be vulnerable to some form of XXE. So yeah, let's just do a quick sort of primer on XML, I guess. So XML is this language here that you're seeing on screen. Basically, it's a set of tags. This is a root tag. And the root tag ends there. You can have tags within tags. So in this case, we have a name tag. And this name tag has a value that's just Tib3rius, right? Technically, tags can also have attributes. So you may have name, or not name actually. You may have, I don't know, age equals, and let's just say I'm 25. I'm not 25, but there we go. All right. So you can have sort of attributes like that. We're not actually going to use any attributes today. We're just going to focus on this. And so I have this basic XXE demo here. And realistically, all this is going to do, this is an XML input. I'm going to click the submit button. The server is going to receive this XML input, and it's going to extract whatever the name element is. So in this case, this value, and it's just going to say, welcome Tib3rius. Okay. And we can actually just change this to welcome David, and there we go. And so that's pretty simple, right? So all the server's doing, it's parsing the XML on the server side, extracting whatever value of the name tag is, and then just basically putting it into the response to the page.
So you've got some code on the server that's obviously receiving the XML, processing it, and then showing the result, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's great. And this is exactly how XML can work. It's fine. You can deliver code, you can deliver values to the server this way. But let's say that let's say we actually wanted to use a special character, like one of these less than symbols, right? So what we can do is we can do something like, let's just say, I love XML. And we can submit that, and we're going to get an error parsing the XML. And that's maybe not as obvious as it should be, but basically these are special characters in XML. And so the idea is, if the XML parser ever encounters one of these, it's really expecting, in this case, a closing tag for the name tag, right? Because it's parsed the name tag. So it's thinking, okay, well, I've got this. The next character should be an N, or sorry, it should be a / for the slash name. And it's not, it's actually a 3. So it sort of just spits out this error, and sort of the entire process just dies there. So one of the things you can do to prevent this, if you really want to use this character, in the XML spec, they have these defined entities. And actually, I have a link that I will share. So this is the XML spec. XML spec has these things called predefined entities. There are 5 of them. So there's basically the less than symbol, there's the greater than symbol, there's ampersands, apostrophes, and double quotes. Okay, so those are the 5, and that's because all 5 of those characters are technically considered special characters in the XML spec. So obviously, less than and greater than are used for tags, and the rest are used basically within attributes usually. And so all we need to do, if we actually want this less than symbol to be parsed correctly and displayed in the welcome message, we just have to do an ampersand less than and then a semicolon. And then if I click submit, now we actually have the result there. Okay, so I'm going to go back to just having Tiberius. And so that's fine. That all works great. But what the XML spec actually says is, okay, well, there's no reason just to limit it to these 5. You can define custom entities. And the way you would do that, in this case, you have to define what's called a doc type. And the doc type basically goes at the start of the XML document, usually after this XML tag. And it's kind of like almost like metadata for the document itself. So the easiest one we can use here is we're going to add this doc type. You can call it anything. It does need a name. I've just called it foo. And we can define this entity. It's technically an internal entity right now. I'll explain the difference between internal and external a bit later. But effectively, all we're doing is we're defining an entity, calling it int, and it's the string Tiberius. Okay? And so if I just submit this right now, it doesn't actually do anything. It's still using Tiberius from the name. But if I want to use this, this defined entity here, I have to reference it in the code. And just like we did with the ampersand LT for a less than symbol, I can do ampersand int and submit, and it says welcome Tiberius. And if I change this to David, it'll say welcome David. So effectively, if this doc type didn't exist, if we delete this doc type, it'll basically say error parsing XML. The entity int was referenced but not declared. Okay, so we have to actually declare it in the doc type. And once we've declared it, it's usable within the XML document itself. So that's really internal entities. This is where it gets a little bit more complicated because entities can reference other entities. The easiest way to display this is with a little bit of code here. So I'm going to change the doc type again. In all these examples, I'm really just keeping the doc type name. I'm just going to change the entities. So in this case, I've got this entity. I've named it x0. It's still the string Tiberius. I've then defined another entity called x1. And this entity is a string still, but it's basically referring to x0. So we have one entity defined as the string Tiberius. We have another entity defined as a reference to this entity. And so if I now reference x1 in the document and submit, we're going to get Tiberius again. And again, just to show you, I can change it to David, and it's doing that. And so that makes sense, right? Because you might want to, I don't know, put, here we go, let's do a reference to David here and just put the word Bumble after it, and then we have welcome David Bumble. Okay, so that kind of makes sense. But we can refer to these entities multiple times if we want. So in this instance, I have, again, x0 set to Tiberius, but now I have x1 set to Tiberius 10 times. And I've also got a space at the end. And so if we actually refer to x1 here, you'll see it's going to print out Tiberius 10 times. And we can keep going. So if I now replace this entity with this one, we have still x0 as Tiberius with a space. We have x1 as a reference to x0 10 times. Now we have x2 as a reference to x1 10 times. So now if we reference x2, we get Tiberius 100 times. And we can keep going. And this is a named attack. It has a Wikipedia page. I think it's honestly the best named attack I've actually seen. It's the billion laughs attack. It's named this way because if I zoom in on this code, this is a relatively short amount of code, right? So that's not that much XML, but it defines the entity. So it defines the entity named LOL as the string LOL. And then LOL1 is a reference to LOL 10 times. LOL2 is a reference to LOL1. And it keeps going all the way till LOL9. And with this bit of code, so this is very small, so it's less than a kilobyte. If this is actually expanded on the server by the XML parser, it takes up about 3 gigabytes of memory. And if you add like an LOL10, right, and you just keep repeating this, that's now 30 gigabytes of memory. And you can just kind of keep going. So it's basically an XML bomb, and it's used to basically denial of service XML parsers and potentially crash entire servers. So this is like bizarre that you can do this. It kind of makes sense. Recursive XML entity expansion kind of makes sense for some instances. But the fact is there's nothing in the XML spec that really says, hey, you should stop stop at a certain level. And so you kind of have to hope that your XML parser has some kind of configuration option to sort of limit the number of recursions that are happening. And thankfully, in a lot of them, they do. They can either say, okay, well, you can't recurse XML entities, or you can recurse up to like 2 layers.
You said in the real world, this is not as common as it used to be, right?
Yeah, so it's not as common in like web applications you'll find online. But very specifically, if you're coding or you're encountering sort of legacy applications, especially, or even regular sort of non-web applications that use some kind of XML as a config option, like just storing configuration values in XML or importing XML sort of stuff, then absolutely you can come across this. And I've run across devs who use XML on a daily basis and had absolutely no idea this was a problem. And I've gone away and checked their code base after I've explained it to them, and they've been shocked and be like, come back. He's like, yeah, there were 30 applications that were just vulnerable to this. And I was like, yeah, I mean, this happens. So, yeah, it's kind of crazy. It's not as common as is something like XSS these days, especially since most parsers usually by default will disable XML entities. But still, there are several parsers that don't. And if those parsers are used, then yeah, it's you're kind of screwed unless you do some configuration.
I mean, it's the disconnect between developers and pen testers, right? And that's why we need people like you, to test the apps.
Okay, so we're back to this where we just had our internal entity. And so I said earlier there are internal and external entities. And you can turn an internal entity into an external entity by just adding the system keyword here. And I'll change this to exe just so we make that clear. Again, this is just a name, so it could be called anything. But system makes this an external entity. And previously, internal meant that basically you're defining the value internally to the document, right? So we were defining just a string, which obviously exists within this document, and that's all that means. External means the value is somewhere external to the document. And it's really up to the XML parser to decide what that means. Usually what it means is this is some kind of URI, okay? So the most obvious one is just a URL, right? So basically an HTTP URL. And I can show that here. If I browse to tib3rius.com/robots.txt, I have a pretty standard robots.txt file, right? User agent star allow / whatever. If I now paste that into here, right, and then replace this reference to the reference of ext here, if I could click submit, it's going to actually make an HTTP request. So the XML parser on the server made an HTTP request to this URL, pulled in the response data, and then displays it as the value. And so that's the difference between internal and external, is that the internal basically is, okay, well, the value is just defined here. If I took out this system value and submit it again, it's just going to display the string. But by including that system value, we're basically telling the XML parser, oh, this is actually the location of the value instead. So you should go here, and that's where the value is going to reside, and you should use that in the document. And so now we have a really interesting way of attacking servers, because this is happening server-side. This is now sort of a server-side request forgery, right? So, we could potentially use it to access internal resources, right? Because this doesn't have to be a link on the internet. This could be some kind of link that's, internal only. You could do a 127.0.0.1 and actually do some relatively less complex, rephrase. You could do something, actually, this is an attack I've done before with XXE, is I've pointed it to an internal address, so basically the local server's address internally, and then I've sort of changed this to port 80, and that's connection refused. I've done, okay, what about 22? Connection refused. I think this is running on port 5000 internally. So I think if we do that, maybe not. Maybe it's 8080. There we go. So effectively, you can actually sort of turn this into an internal port scanner, especially if you're getting some kind of different response down here based on whether a port is open or closed. And you could change this to any kind of internal address, right? If we're assuming that this is a 192.168 network, you could just iterate over different sort of ending IP numbers and try and find different ports. So that's a kind of cool vulnerability. Cool exploit you can do with this is you can basically turn it into an SSRF. And notably also, the XML spec, again, doesn't really say how the system keyword should be used other than, hey, this is just, it's external for document. It kind of just leaves it up to the parsers on implementation. We could debate whether that's a good idea or not. But if, like I said, effectively, all the parsers generally just accept any kind of URI. I've used HTTP here, but there's no reason why we couldn't just use file, right? So if I do file :/ and then /etc/password and click submit, we can actually extract internal files.
It's crazy.
So we've got
does that.
the internal system file. Yeah, so we've got the internal XE password file, again, from the server that's running this application.
Did you always wonder what devs are thinking, man.
Yeah, so not only is it an SSRF, it's technically kind of a local file inclusion in the fact that we can access these local files and potentially print out their contents. And, we could do this with Etsy Shadow. And in this case, this will work because this application is actually technically running as root. So this is a really nice way of actually checking whether the application is running as root as well. Obviously, if there were password hashes in there, that's great. But we could extract that kind of information. Also, and this is unique to Java as far as I'm aware, I've never encountered any other programming language that does this. I'm a fan of Java, so I'm not going to hear any people speak against Java. You can put it in the comments. But for some reason, and I don't know why, but when in Java especially, if you reference a directory and you try and read from a directory, like in a file operation, it just prints out a list of all the files in that directory. Again, I haven't come across any other programming language that treats directories like this, but this is why I wrote this example in Java, because this is actually a really cool way of doing it. Because you can literally, one of the problems with XXE is you have to know, which files exist on the server. We can get Etsy password. We know that exists. But if you're actually using XXE to hunt for specific files on the server, it's kind of a lot of guesswork, right? But if it's a Java application, you can just reference any kind of directory and it will print out the contents of that directory, including hidden files, by the way. So there's an example of a hidden file.
No, that's just crazy. It's a great demo, man. I love it.
Thank you. So the other example of what you can do with XML entities, at least at this kind of level, is you can define something called a parameter entity. And I don't know why it's called a parameter entity, but effectively what it is an entity. So far, we've been defining entities in the doc type and then using them in the document. By defining a parameter entity, which I do by putting a % before the entity name, this now defines an entity which can only ever be referenced within the doc type. So if I try and use it here, it's going to basically complain because it says, oh, well, you referenced this entity, it wasn't declared. Well, it was declared here, but it was declared as a parameter entity. And this will become important when we move on to sort of the less basic stuff. It's just important to note, this is basically defining a special type of entity which only really exists or only can be referenced within the doc type itself. It's extremely useful when we get onto the more advanced stuff, though, as we'll see. And so I have an advanced demo. Just open it up here.
Just want to confirm that people can get these demos from your GitHub, right?
Yeah, I'll upload them to GitHub. I'll send you guys a link. Okay, so this is a slightly more advanced demo. So this is error-based XXE. So in this case, what's happening here, data is basically being parsed still. So it's processing some XML, but it's not actually displaying any data. So I can't, if I change the name here, it doesn't really matter. Nothing is being displayed, right? So I could change this to David, and it's just saying, oh, by the way, I processed your XML. So this is kind of useless for, trying to do the stuff we've been doing before because we can't just extract data as easily as we could. However, if I try that other example, right, I love XML and submit, we get this error. So occasionally, even when you have instances where you have the ability to send XML to the application, even if it's not actually displaying the XML itself, it may still display an error, and it may actually print out the error specifically from the parser. So this is actually an error specific to the XML parser that's running on the server. The contents of the elements must consist of well-formed character data or markup. And that's because it basically got triggered by this special character. And so effectively, what we need to do is find a way of extracting data and putting it into the error message itself. And there are a few ways of doing that. There's a super easy way, though, which we'll do right now. But we basically have to host our own document type definition file. So basically, a doc type that's hosted externally, and then we can reference that from the XML file itself. And so what we'll do, I'm going to switch to my notepad. And so what I have here is a malicious.dtd. So DTD is just doc type definition. And so what I've done is I've defined a parameter entity called ext. It's an external entity because of the system keyword, and it's trying to extract the XXE password file. And this is where it gets a little complicated because we're going to define another parameter entity, which is called eval. This isn't a system, so this isn't an external entity, it's internal. However, the value is this lovely string, which is kind of complicated, and we'll go over it in a second. So just ignore this for now. But effectively, what happens when we then, remember, we're still in the doc type definition, and so we can refer to these parameter entities. So we then reference this parameter entity eval. Well, what does it do? Well, it basically sort of creates an instance of this string. And this string itself is another entity definition. So this is just a percentage symbol that's encoded. It has to be encoded, otherwise it would spit out an error message. But effectively what we're doing is by calling, I guess, a reference of the eval entity, we're actually creating this other entity in its place. And this entity is called error. It's an external entity called system, and it's going to actually try and hit this file address. And this file address, again, is quite interesting. So it's file : / so that's basically just the scheme, right? And then / non-existent / and then a reference, right, to the ext entity up here.
Nice.
So then it's going to call that entity down here. And so basically what it's going to do effectively when we load this file, this document type definition in the XML, as soon as it gets to this part, the file that it's actually going to try and load here is going to be / non-existent / and then the contents of the XXE password file. So it's basically, it's placing the contents of the XXE password file into the path and then trying to load that. That's obviously not going to exist, right? And so what does it do? It spits out an error message saying this file does not exist, and then it will give us the file name it tried to access, which contains XXE password. So again, kind of complicated.
Very nice. No, it's great.
And I'm sorry if people aren't following, but hopefully when I show it, it'll be slightly more obvious. But we do need to host this file. So I'm actually going to run a small Python web server. Okay, so it's running on port 8000. And so that's just going to host the malicious.dtd file. And then all we need to do is go back to our payload and take out this. So we'll put Tib3rius back in there. But now all I'm doing is I'm defining another parameter entity. This one just called XXE. It's an external entity because we're referencing that DTD that we just created. And here it is. So this is just the IP address of my local machine, port 8000, malicious.dtd. So that defines the entity. Because it's a parameter entity, we can then refer to the parameter within the doc type. And hopefully, if I click submit, there we go. Error parsing XML / non-existent / and then here's the contents of the XXE password file. And if we scroll down, no such file or directory. So effectively, we snuck the contents of the XXE password file into a file path. Then we told it, hey, can you please access this file path? And because it can't, it's like, oh, I'll give a helpful error message that I couldn't access this file path. But that actually contained the information we wanted.
Very cool. Very cool.
Yeah. And so, yeah, like I said at the beginning, this is how crazy XXE just suddenly gets. Like the fact you can kind of do this is insane. However, And this is where I'll talk about a tool that I created, because obviously, even if you find this error-based stuff, and I found it before, if you notice, every time you want to extract a new file, like we extracted Etsy password, right? If I want to extract a new file, I have to go into the malicious.dtd and I have to update it. So save that there. And then I have to go back here, resubmit, and then we can get the Etsy shadow file, right? But I was doing that when I found this one time, like so many years ago, I can't remember. I was doing this and I was just like update. So I had the file hosted on a server, an internet server that I could just access via the XML. So I had it hosted. I just kept updating it. And I was like, there's got to be an easier way of doing this. And so what I eventually created was an application called Dynamic DTD. So if we go to my GitHub, Tib3rius /Dynamic DTD. So this is basically a Python Flask application that you can run on some external server. And I wouldn't run it 24/7. I would just spin it up when you need to. I don't think there are any vulnerabilities in it, but we'll see. And effectively what this does is it allows you to effectively create DTDs dynamically via URL parameters. And so I'll show you how that works here. But effectively, if I go back to this and we go into Dynamic DTD, all you really need to do is change the app.config callback value to some kind of web server. And this could be, honestly, it could be a web server that you already have running. It can even be the web server you're going to run Dynamic DTD on. Okay, and that's what we're going to do in this case. So I'm going to run Dynamic DTD on port 9000. And so I'm just going to copy this code. We're going to CD into Dynamic DTD, and we're going to run it using Flask, run -p 9000, and then the host is just, again, this port. And if you're running this on a web server, you can either bind to whatever the port is, bind to whatever the IP address that will actually get web traffic. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So we'll run this. And now what I can do is I can actually, if I have a link, let's actually see what this does. If I go to the browser again, I'm going to browse to this address. So port 9000 /error.dtd, passing it a resource equals file. Actually, let me actually open a new one. So I'm going to browse to this URL. Okay. So we're hosting it on port 9000. So we're basically browsing to in this case, my local IP address, 9000 /error.dtd, because we're using error-based DTDs. Resource equals file : / and then /Etsy /password. And if I browse that in my web browser here, it's going to have this lovely error message. But if you actually go to view source, and let me zoom in a bit and do a line wrap, you can hopefully see that. Let me highlight it a bit better. So it's effectively the same DTD that we were generating before, right? So, it's exactly the same as this one, right? So file Etsy password, non-existent, eval and error. It's exactly that. The difference is if I replace Etsy password in the URL with Etsy shadow, now it's dynamically updated it. And so let's use that in the actual XML here. So if I just replace this entire doc type. So we're using it here. Again, exactly the same kind of thing. Submit, and we get the Etsy password, and I can change this to shadow, submit, get the shadow file. So you no longer have to update the actual malicious.dtd file, save it, refresh the payload. If you're doing this in, let's say, Burp Suite, right? So here we have Burp Suite. Let's send this to Intruder. I can now sort of just go into here. Hang on. I can find the reference to Etsy password, which is right here, and I can sort of fuzz this value. I can give it a list of known web servers or known server paths, right? File paths on the web server, and just fuzz them. And in the results, I'll be able to extract, hopefully a lot of data that way without having to go and change the malicious.dtd file, resave it, refresh the page, etc. Yeah, this was created out of frustration.
Yeah.
It's relatively simple, but
go on.
It's it's a relatively simple application. Like, it didn't really take much effort, but it was the fact that just it didn't exist before. And I'm like, why were people doing XXE exploitation the hard way for years? So yeah.
I mean, it's that's what's so great, right? That I really appreciate you giving back to the community, because it makes the lives of the next generation of pen testers so much better.
Yeah. I mean, that's honestly, most of my tools come from personal issues that I've encountered while testing, that I'd be like, why hasn't anyone done this before? And I'm like, people could really benefit from this. And that's why I really encourage people, if you are developing tools, and you can, because I understand a lot of people unfortunately have to keep their tools internal, but if you can publish tools, then you absolutely should. Because, people can go and fork the tool and improve it ultimately, or they can submit back with pull requests. So absolutely, if you use my tool, please submit pull requests for new features if you can think of them. That'd be awesome. Okay, so I got one more demo, and this is kind of similar, but this is an out of band demo. So previously, we've been able to, in various ways, extract information from the XXE directly in the web page, right? Even when we weren't supposed to, right? Even when it wasn't actually giving us any data back originally, we could trip it up. So in this case, we have a proper out-of-band XXE demo. So it's not going to give me anything. So in this case, what I've done, previously, the actual error from the parser was being returned in the error message. In this case, I basically just have a very generic, there was an error, I'm not going to tell you any information. So this is actually kind of secure, right? You're not supposed to spit out stack trace error, like error messages in your code. You should always be catching any kind of exceptions and displaying something generic. So this is secure in the sense that it's not revealing any information via the error message. It's still vulnerable to XXE. So what can we do here? We can actually use the fact that we know XXE can access external resources to try and sort of extract limited information. And we'll see what I mean by limited. But let's use another malicious DTD file. And so I'm just going to change this one. So in this case, it looks very similar, right? So we have a parameter entity called file. It's an external entity by the system keyword. And this time we're just going to try and extract etc hostname. And similarly, we have this eval parameter parameter entity. And this again defines another entity. The fact you can do this is again kind of crazy. This time it's exfiltrate. It's an external entity, and now it refers to a web server, right? It's actually going to refer to this Python web server that we're already hosting malicious.dtd on. And it's actually going to pass the contents of the file in this URL x parameter. Okay, so basically x equals, and then this is a reference to this entity here. So we call eval just to get this exfiltrate entity defined, and then we call exfiltrate. So if I save this, so now this is what malicious.dtd points to. If I now go back here, and we're going to replace this doc type again with just a reference to malicious.dtd, and then call the XXE entity reference here. If I click submit, we get error processing XML again, but hopefully if this actually worked, we should get a GET request, right? So this is the GET request to malicious.dtd, and this GET request goes to x equals this thing, which just happens to be the host name. I'm using Docker, so it's a randomized host name, but this was able to extract the host name by effectively sending it in another HTTP request. And this is why I used host name, because this is honestly the unfortunate reality of this kind of attack, is that because URLs can't really have new lines in them, or at least you'd have to encode the new lines. If I try and access the password file right now, if I just save this and we click submit again, and then we go back here, we don't get any second request, right? We just get the hit to malicious. It just doesn't send it. So this is a limited attack. Realistically, you can only extract data from files where you know there's only one line. In some instances, and I have seen it, it does properly encode new line characters to like %0L or %0D. And in that case, that's great. So I would definitely try extracting full files this way. Unfortunately, unlikely to happen. But we can do this using dynamic DTD as well. In this case, I have to use a different URL. So instead of error.dtd, I have out of band or oob.dtd. The resource, again, is just going to be file / and then /etc/hostname. And so we can do this again. Let's go back to here, replace this. So again, we have the entity. We defined it as XXE, and it's just going to hit this endpoint. So this is dynamic DTD with a file resource pointing here. And we're going to call the XXE entity again, submit, and then hopefully if I go back here, yeah, there we go. So we get that hostname extracted. So yeah, thank you. And yeah, like I said, like I hinted at the beginning, this isn't really an injection attack. I think OWASP actually classify it as a security misconfiguration because these can usually be solved by actually configuring the XML parser. There are ways to either turn off external entities. To be honest, I can't really think of many instances where you'd actually need external entities when using XML. It's kind of just one of those weird features that was thrown into the spec. There are certainly some instances I'm sure people have actually legitimately used them. But generally speaking, if you're a developer and you want to protect against this, you should make sure that you're looking, whenever you use an XML parser in your code, you should be looking at the options, the configuration options. Don't just randomly just define an instance of it, pass it some XML to parse. You should be configuring it, make sure you turn off as many options that you're not using as possible.
I mean, that's a difference in thinking, right? A hacker way of thinking versus a developer way of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, that's like you said, that's why I'm hired, is to let developers know, hey, by the way, you should be looking into this a bit more.
So, Tib3rius, this is amazing. I really enjoyed this demo. Thanks so much for spending the time, putting together a demo, not just PowerPoints, but showing us practically how this works. And, thanks also for, sharing the code on GitHub. Really appreciate it. So for everyone who's watching, I've put those links below. Go and show the love. So Tib3rius, you got to show us your YouTube again. And I wanted to ask you, if people have got questions, where's a good place? Is it Twitch or LinkedIn or Twitter, X, whatever it's called these days? Where's a good place to, make contact?
Yeah, I'm fairly active across most social platforms. So I think I have my biggest following on X, but I'm also on Blue Sky, which I know is getting more popular now. Hopefully it's going to continue to grow. I know a lot of good creators are over on Blue Sky. So either of those platforms really, I think, are the best way to reach me.
So I'll put all your links below. So for everyone who's watching, go and reach out, ask questions. And Twitch is great as well, right? So they can join your Twitch live streams, and then they can ask you questions there as well. That's related to the content that you're covering, right? Sorry, go on.
Yeah. If you join the chat on a live stream, I always say there are no dumb questions. I'm happy to answer any questions that the people ask in chat during the live stream. I also stream live on YouTube, so I actually multi-stream to YouTube as well.
That's brilliant. So for everyone who's watching again, links below. Tib3rius, thanks so much for sharing. And, I always say this, I really appreciate people like you who have, walked a road and are making it easier for the next generation. That old stupid saying, when I was young, I walked up the hill, in barefoot in the snow backwards, or whatever the stupid saying is. We don't need that. We need people like you helping the next generation to make it easier for them. So thanks so much for sharing.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This has been an absolute joy.
It's brilliant, man. Thanks.